Welcome to the PHP Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're actually going to look at functions in PHP Part 2. We just finished up Part 1. Now we're going to actually go and look at some additional information that we need to know about functions as we work through the Essential Training Series in PHP. The function keyword defines a function inside of PHP. You actually saw me demonstrate that in the previous exercise. So we always start our function with the function keyword. Then we have the name of our function. Then inside parentheses, we have any arguments that we're going to send into the function. And then inside the curly braces, the actual code that's going to execute when that function is called. So the code that makes up the function is always contained within the curly braces, as we saw in the previous tutorial. We also demonstrated that we can add arguments to our functions and pass in values that we can manipulate with the code contained inside that function. So remember, we demonstrated a couple different demonstrations in the previous tutorial where we actually passed in some arguments to our function, and that function manipulated the values of those arguments and then sent out a return for us, so we could actually use that return inside of our code. Every time we call a function, we have to include the function name and any arguments that the function requires. So if the function does require arguments, we've got to pass those in when we call the function inside the parentheses. And they'll always be separated by commas. So the arguments are always contained in parentheses. And if there's more than one, we always separate them by commas. Remember that we have a requirement. If the function requires two arguments, we have to send in two arguments. Even if one of them's empty, we still have to separate that by comma and include in quotation marks the empty value for that argument, or else the function is not going to perform correctly. There are times when your function will not require any arguments, but the parentheses will always be required even if they're empty. And you're going to see that quite a bit. You're going to see a lot of functions inside PHP that are called with no arguments at all, because it's just performing some string functions or some value functions or maybe arithmetic functions, whatever. But the fact is it's not actually having any arguments at all. You're just calling the function to perform some calculations or some manipulations of text, and it's going to pass you out a return. Not unusual. Just remember that you always have to have the parentheses there, even if there's no arguments. You'll just pass them in empty. Functions that do not have an implicit return value use a return code to indicate whether they completed successfully or not. So there's a lot of times when we don't have an implicit return from the function, but we'll still need to know whether the function performed correctly, and we'll have a 0 or false would indicate a failure of the function, so the code inside the curly braces did not perform correctly, and a 1 or true would indicate a success of the code. And it's not that unusual to see this, and all functions, or most functions inside most programming languages, do this very same thing. A lot of them don't require implicit returns, but we will require some type of acknowledgement that the function performed correctly. The arguments are always contained in parentheses, like I said before. If there's more than one argument, you always separate them with commas. I can't stress that enough. That's a fundamental understanding of functions. And there are times when your function will not require any arguments, but the parentheses will always be required, even if they're empty. So don't forget that. Even if the function requires no arguments at all, you always have to have the parentheses empty. Let's go ahead and demonstrate some of this in our development environment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let me minimize the presentation, get into our development environment. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and confirm that we've got the Apache server up and running, which it is. And again, because we'll be processing PHP code, this is server-side scripting language, you've got to make sure that your server is up and running and that you've got PHP properly installed on that server in order to process the code that we're going to write. And I'm sure you do if you've been following along with me this far. I'm going to go ahead and load up Google Chrome, which is going to be my browser I'll use for this demonstration, and my text editor, Sublime Text 2. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and save this base file. I have a copy of the base file in my text editor, and that's what I'll be using to start this exercise. If you have access to the exercise files, you'll have that in the exercise folder. I'm just going to go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as exercise or example 1. Let me go ahead and get our screen positioned here inside of our development environment. Just going to go ahead and save this as example 1. So again, you'll have all these copies of all these files inside your exercise folder if you have access to them. The first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and demonstrate what we were talking about earlier when I said we can have functions that don't require arguments, because that is an important concept inside functions. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to copy an H2 heading. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in the body element of my text editor, I'm going to go ahead and save that change. I also want to go back into my browser and make sure that I've got example 1 loaded. And now you see I'm going to do a mail example function. And that's what you're seeing right there is the H2 that we just put into that browser. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy this PHP code, and I'll talk through this in one moment. But I'm going to come right below that H2. I'm going to go ahead and paste in a PHP block and get rid of some of these additional lines. That looks pretty good. Looks like it's formatted pretty well. And what I've done is I've opened up my PHP block with my lesson sign, question mark PHP. Don't forget to close that block once you open it. And I'm creating a function here called mail script. So you'll notice I've got my function keyword, then mail script is the name of the function itself. I've got my empty parentheses because we're not passing in any arguments. And then I've got my opening curly brace. And what I've done is here, I've actually put a conditional statement inside this function. And it says if mail, and then I've got an email address, one of my on-target HTML5 email addresses. I've set in a subject and I've set in some body text. So I said if this mail goes out successfully, so if I'm calling this mail script function and I get my mail out successfully, I want to echo back email was sent successfully. And if it doesn't go out successfully, just echo back email could not be sent. So it's a very, very simple function that's running a conditional statement, and it'll just let us know whether or not this email was sent or not. I'm going to go ahead and save all these changes to example 1. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. That'd be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. One of the things we talked about in our earlier exercise is the only way, you'll notice when I refresh this browser window, nothing occurs. Because one of the unique things about functions is in order for a function to work, we've got to call it first. So I'm going to come right down below where I closed out my PHP tag, and I'm going to open up a new PHP tag, and I'm going to type in my mail script, open and close my parentheses, and that with a semicolon, and then close my PHP tag. And I want to save that change. So now I'm actually calling that script, or I'm calling that function to run by using this PHP block to call it. I could have actually put this mail script inside my existing PHP block. I could have put it right there. As long as I was outside the function, I could have called it inside that PHP block. But I actually wanted to call it this way because I want you to understand that you can have numerous PHP blocks inside your HTML documents. And in fact, when you're building dynamic websites, you normally will have numerous PHP blocks inside of your HTML websites. And we'll probably get into a future tutorial where I'll actually do a project where we do a very small CMS website, and you'll see what I mean by having numerous PHP blocks inside of an HTML document. But let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. And you'll notice now I'm getting my echo back telling me that the email was sent successfully. So PHP detected that I had a mail script running on my server, on my Apache server. It processed this email. It sent it to admin@ontargethtml5.com. Inside the subject area, it put hello. And inside the body of the email, it actually put this is a test email. And that's just based on the formatting of the email app that's inside PHP, because that's the actual application or function that it called in PHP, the mail function, to actually send out that email message. And again, we just practice using a function with no arguments. So we basically just called the function and let the function work through its code. And based on the fact that I had the mail function operating correctly inside PHP, inside my Apache server, it actually sent that email out successfully. All right, so let me go through another example because I really want you to understand, have a good grasp of how functions work, because we use them all the time inside of our PHP code. I'm going to go ahead and remove what we have there. I'm going to do a save as on this. I'm going to save this as example 2. So again, if you have access to the exercise files, you'll have access to these. I'm going to go ahead and put in a new heading inside my H2 tags. And then after that heading, I want to put in a different function. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this from the exercise file so you don't have to watch me type. I'm going to come up under that H2 and I'm going to go ahead and paste this in place, and we'll talk about this in 1 second. So again, I've opened up another PHP block. Let's go ahead and save those changes. I'm going to go ahead and go back and refresh my browser window and load up example number 2. And you'll see we have this greeting function, but all I've done is I've created a function using my function keyword, and I've called it disMessage for display message, and it's just going to echo to my screen, take care and have a nice time. So all I'm doing is I'm echoing to the screen a block of text. And the only reason I wanted to do this, I want you to understand a couple different things here that we can do with functions. I'm going to go ahead again. Let's go ahead and save all these changes. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. I want to go ahead and copy from my exercise file. And again, you can type this in if you wish. I've just got a break tag. So I'm going to give myself a line feed. And then I'm going to call that function disMessage. And when I save that change, if you want to go ahead and pause and type in, good time. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window, and you'll see that we're echoing that message back. Take care, have a nice time. So whatever I have inside this function is what's going to be displayed. And in fact, I could actually put another line of code in there. Let's just add an additional line. I'm just going to put down today is sunny, even though I know it's not. It sounded good. And actually I want to put a line break, so I'm going to put a break tag so these come up on two different lines inside my initial echo statement. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and then refresh the browser window. And you'll notice now we get both those lines of code executed when it calls that function. But what I'm trying to demonstrate in this particular example is I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And I'm going to paste this in a couple more times right underneath my original code. You're not limited. Go ahead and save those changes. And go ahead and pause if you want to type all this in. But you're not limited when you call a function inside your HTML or inside your code itself to limit it to calling it one time. You can call it as many times as you need it to run. So you'll notice I've just basically given myself a line feed, called the function, given myself a line feed, called the function, given myself a line feed and called the function. You can see it's responded to all three times, calling that function. And it's not something that's unusual. We do that a lot. You'll normally create functions inside your PHP code that you may need to call hundreds of times as you're doing different things with the code itself. I'm going to go and show you another example. And again, here inside my function, now I'm actually echoing back another value from a function. So I've got the time is with my colon, then I use that concatenation symbol we talked about in an earlier tutorial, and I'm adding another built-in function in PHP and formatting how I want to see that time displayed. So I'm basically giving myself the time every time I call this. And if I run the code, you'll see now that we've done the very same thing. In fact, I probably should have put a line break here also. So let's go ahead and save that change. So it just gives us a line feed after each one of our lines. And you'll see now it's 11:06 a.m. based on the time that's actually inside my server. That's where we're actually getting that from. So again, you can call functions numerous times inside your code just by merely calling the function. And you can see that's one of the powers of having functions, because now instead of having to write this code each time, I just have to call the function and it runs the code for me. And I can have this scattered throughout my application. All right, I want to go back into our presentation for a minute because I want to talk to you about variable scope, because understanding the scope of your variables is extremely important in programming. I'm going to go ahead and minimize my browser, minimize my Sublime Text 2, and let's go ahead and go back into our presentation. And let's talk about variable scope in functions. There's a reason that values have to be passed into PHP functions as arguments, and it has to do with variable scope. And what I mean by variable scope is where a variable can be accessed inside your application. Variable scope is the rules that determine what sections of our code have access to the variables that we declare. As a rule of thumb, variables that are defined in the main body of the code cannot be used inside a function. And likewise, variables that are used inside of a function cannot be seen by the main code. And that may seem very confusing because I can almost hear you saying, oh, well, wait a minute, how do I pass values back and forth if functions can't see variables outside the function and variables inside the function can't be seen by the code that's in the main code body? There are ways of doing it. You're going to see that as we work through a lot more demonstrations inside PHP. But variables available within a function are said to be local variables, or variables that are scope of the variable is local to the function. Variables that are not local are called global variables. Local and global variables can have the same name and contain different values, although it's a best practice not to share variable names between local and global variables. And actually, as you're going to see as we get further along in our training, there's things that we do as developers and programmers when we name global variables so we can recognize right away that that's a global variable. And a lot of people will capitalize the first letter of the variable name. Some people will start it with a capital and an underscore, like a G underscore or whatever, however they like to set up their global variables. But every developer, every programmer has their own way of identifying global variables just by glancing through their code. They can tell by the variable name that it's scoped global. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate a little bit more about functions in PHP. But in this aspect, we're actually going to focus on the scope of variables inside of our PHP code. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's go ahead and open up our browser. I'm going to go ahead and open up Sublime Text 2, which is my text editor. And in this particular example, I'm going to go ahead and go back here. Let's reload that. I want to do a save as, because I actually want to save this as example 3. So we have all these in our exercise files. And I'm going to go ahead and take this code out. Let's go ahead and change our heading. I'm just going to put variables up here, variable scope, because that's what we're going to actually be demonstrating in this demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and save that as our number 3, and I'm going to go ahead and load up number 3 inside of our browser window. Now the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and create another function. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type. And then I'm just going to come below my H2 and go ahead and paste this into my document. You'll notice I'm creating a variable called display value. And then I'm echoing a value to our screener inside of our browser window. And right here, I'm assigning a value of 125 to this value variable. And then I'm calling my function display value because we know that we have to call the function in order for it to operate. The one thing I want you to understand though is I'm echoing the value variable here, and I'm declaring the value of that variable outside the function. So if I save the change and I update my browser window or refresh it, you're going to see it's undefined variable value in line 11. And that's what we expected. Line 11 is right there. And it's telling me that the value variable doesn't exist, because technically it doesn't exist. It's inside a function, and I haven't done anything to give that a value. Now, we could have actually gotten that value in there. What if I passed in, and let's just call this, because I don't want to use the same names because I don't want to confuse you. I'm just going to call this number. And then I'm going to say that number is equal to value. I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking a variable number and I'm assigning it the value of value, and I'm passing it into this this function when I call the function. But now what I've got to have here is I actually have to give that a value. So I'm just going to assign this value. And again, that could be equal to, now, you know what? Yeah, I'm just going to assign a value. That could be equal to anything. But because I've passed that in, if I save this and I refresh my browser window, I no longer get that error, because I actually do now. I've taken this number, I've assigned it to a variable, and I've passed that in as an argument to my function. So that's how I actually get to use that value inside the function. Then I could actually return it as something else. I could actually return it as, let's say we created a value here, or a variable here called num2 equals the return. Oh, no, I want to say return value. Just return num2 equal value. That should work. If I save that change, refresh my browser window, I shouldn't see any errors, which I do not. And now I've got a num2 value here. So I should be able to come right down here and say echo num2. I should be able to save that change, refresh the browser window. Oh, undefined. That's because I didn't define it here. What I need to do is I actually have to have num2 signed up here, and I just assign it to nothing. So it's equal nothing, because then it's scoped. And that gets rid of our value. So you can see that based on how variables are declared inside of our code makes a big difference as to where they're available. I want to go through one additional demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and pull that code out. And I want to do one additional demonstration. And this is actually a pretty good one, because this should really close the door on you understanding global scope, or understanding the scope of variables. So I'm going to come right up underneath that H2. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. Let's go ahead and save this change into our browser. And I'm creating a function called change value. But you'll notice inside the function, I'm globally scoping value. Now by using that global keyword, value now has a scope inside and outside my function. Then I'm asking it echo before, so I'm echoing this value inside the function before I actually take the value and multiply it. And then I come down here, I'm assigning value equal, so keep in mind, I'm going to assign the value of 100 to this value variable before we run the function, because here's where I'm actually calling that function. So I come into the function and I've got a value of 100, I'm echoing the value, then I'm taking the value and multiplying it by 2, and then I'm coming down here and echoing the value again. So the first time I see the echo, I should see 100. The second time I see the echo, I should see 200. Because I've already performed this function. Remember, it's walking through our function code. So let's go ahead and save all those changes, refresh our browser window, and you'll see before it's 100, here's where I echoed it going into the function. And again, because it's declared as a global variable, I can use it inside and outside my function. And here I take that value and multiply it by 2, then I'm finished with my function and I come down and run this line of code. So this kind of gives you an idea of how code flows inside of PHP, but it also shows you that when we use global variables, we can actually use them inside and outside functions. That is not to say, and let me emphasize this, please, don't make all your variables global. You don't want to do that, because one, they take up resources in the system. They take up memory because now they're available throughout the program, so they're always there working. There are some times when it's good to use global variables, when you'll want to use them, but you should never use only global variables, global variable scope. That's not a good programming practice. It's not a best practice. And as we work through more and more demonstrations inside PHP and programming inside PHP scripting language, you'll see when it's appropriate to use globals and when it's not. A lot of times when we're using sessions, when we're using cookies, those are global variables, and you'll notice they're all in capital letters, they have an underscore. That's why. Because that's how PHP designates global variables. But there are some times when global variables are good, there's other times when they're really not. So don't use them for everything, but there are times when you'll want to use a global variable, and this is how we do that global variable distinction, by giving it the keyword global and then the variable name. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about functions in PHP. And I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.